It's Liza Lawrence here with the mini message for Wonders and Miracles podcast. This is episode 146, Spiritual Nourishment. How often do we nourish our spiritual body? I've just come off of a weekend of a big spiritual feast. In my church, we had a big conference for Saturday and Sunday, and we got to hear the general speakers of the church, and it was really edifying. And so I feel full spiritually, but I want to think about this idea of how often are we feeding our spiritual bodies? Many years ago, I had an experience that shifted my mindset from a more physical, temporal mindset to a more spiritual mindset. Not that I'm perfect at it. The world still pulls at me quite a bit. So one day I was visiting a beautiful sacred place for me, and I was spending time in just quiet contemplation, meditation. And I had a thought enter my mind, a question. And the question said, how often do you nourish your body? And I thought to myself, well, I feed my body 3 times a day, plus a little extra, plus more with my snacks and treats. I mean, I'm feeding my body quite often. And then the question, the Spirit said to me, how often do you nourish your spiritual body? I thought this was a really great question. I had just answered about my physical body. But when I went to think about how often am I nourishing my spiritual body, I realized that I can go days without spiritual eating, even weeks, perhaps maybe months, where I don't spiritually feast or eat or do anything or even quench my thirst. I realized I'm really lacking, and it was as though I could see my spiritual body was really emaciated and weak and starving, and I wasn't feeding it enough and giving it enough nutrition in the spiritual sense. I took care of my physical body, and that's been a big priority of mine, but I wasn't really taking care of my spiritual body. So it was a good awakening question for me and a good awareness for me to think about and to reflect on. And of course, that was actually at the time when I started practicing more deep spiritual things, more meditation, deep prayer, scripture study, but not on the surface. I went a lot deeper. I was hungry, and I could tell that my spirit was hungry and it wanted some deep nourishment. If you think about it, if you treated your physical body without feeding it often, you wouldn't have the energy or the health to accomplish the goals or the tasks that you needed to accomplish. You would be too weak and too tired. Same thing with our spirit. If we neglect our spiritual nourishment, how will we ever accomplish the things that God is asking us to accomplish? How will we have the energy to fulfill the spiritual desires of our hearts and the tasks that we came here to do? How will we ever accomplish our spiritual progression and growth if we're not feeding and nourishing our spirits? God accomplishes his designs through us. But if we are too spiritually weak, he can't rely on us. He can't call on us to do his will and to get it done, because we won't be strong enough. He'll give it to somebody else. He'll move on and say, well, they're capable spiritually to handle that because they're spiritually stronger. And it doesn't mean we have to be perfect, but we do have to have some spiritual fuel to run the race set before us, to fulfill our spiritual mission and purpose and goals. We do need that strength. So, how often are you feeding your spirit? What does spiritual nourishment look like for you? It might look very different for different people. What feeds your soul? What quenches your thirst? What do you feast on spiritually to give yourself that strength? And what is distracting you? What physical things, temporal things are distracting you from not eating the spiritual things? So, those are some of my questions today to think about. I think it's really important at this time in history and the things that are going on in the world. God needs people who have strength, who can hear him and are feeding themselves spiritually so he can rely on us to accomplish some of the things he would like us to accomplish. I think it's also important to think about that you don't just engorge yourself all of at one time and feel like, okay, I'm full, I never need to eat again. Sometimes when you're so weak, you just have to take it little by little. Start with one little thing. Maybe start out with prayer. Maybe next step, start out with spiritual thoughts. Maybe next read, a spiritual talk or a scripture. But take it, you don't have to just engorge yourself. Might be too overwhelming. Take it little by little, line upon line, step by step, and build the habits of constant spiritual nourishment. The scriptures talk a lot about pray always, let virtue garnish thy thoughts unceasingly, pray unto the Lord with all thine heart. Like there's so many things to talk about how we do need that constant nourishment. And I think especially to get through the commotion of the world and the noise of the world, our spiritual bodies need food. So what are you doing to feed your spiritual body? And how can you increase the nourishment that you're giving it? So that's my thought for this week. Hope you have a great week. We'll talk to you next week with an awesome interview. Bye-bye.